The Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock. He was England's greatest warrior, then died 1 year before his throne.
On September 19, 1356, the vineyards and sloping fields near Poitiers, France, became the stage for one of the most astonishing military upsets of the Middle Ages. An exhausted, disease-ridden, and vastly outnumbered English army found itself cornered by a massive French force led by King John II of France. Command of the English troops fell to a 26-year-old heir to the English throne, a prince who had spent the previous 8 weeks marching roughly 300 miles across enemy territory in a brutal campaign of destruction. As the French heavy cavalry charged, the young commander ordered a disciplined defensive stand, utilizing dismounted men-at-arms and deadly Welsh longbowmen. By the end of the bloody afternoon, not only was the French army routed, but King John II himself had been taken prisoner. The architect of this victory was Edward of Woodstock, an English royal who would become the most celebrated military commander of the 14th century. To his contemporaries, he was the living embodiment of Arthurian chivalry. To later generations, he would be known by a darker, more legendary moniker, the Black Prince. Edward of Woodstock, born June 15, 1330, died June 8, 1376, was the eldest son of King Edward III of England and Philippa of Hainault. As the heir apparent to the English throne, he held a sequence of unprecedented royal titles, being created the Earl of Chester in 1333, the first Duke of Cornwall in 1337, and the Prince of Wales in 1343. He was an English royal, military commander, and later the ruling Prince of Aquitaine, 1362 to 1372. Operating primarily in the theatre of the Hundred Years' War, Edward was the defining military figure of his generation. He is considered profoundly influential because his tactical innovations, leadership, and aggressive campaigns permanently altered the balance of power in Western Europe, severely destabilized the French monarchy, and elevated the English crown to the height of its medieval military prestige. Edward was born into a kingdom still recovering from political trauma. Just 3 years before his birth, his grandfather, Edward II, had been deposed and murdered in a coup, leading to the eventual assumption of power by his father, Edward III. Born at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, the young Edward was introduced to the realities of power and wealth almost immediately. To secure his son's financial independence and political authority, Edward III took the unprecedented step of creating the Duchy of Cornwall in March 1337, explicitly to provide an income for the royal heir. This granted the 7-year-old prince the vast revenues from southwestern England's lucrative tin mining industry. Edward's childhood was shaped by the highest standards of medieval aristocratic education. He was tutored by eminent scholars, most notably Walter Burleigh, an Aristotelian philosopher who instilled in the prince the classical virtues of leadership and governance. However, the cultural environment of the 1330s and 1340s was heavily dominated by a revival of Arthurian romance and martial prestige. Edward III actively cultivated a chivalric court, hosting lavish tournaments and framing his rule within the legends of Camelot. Consequently, the young prince's education heavily emphasized equestrian skills, swordplay, and military strategy. By the age of 8, Edward was already participating in ceremonial armor, and the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War in 1337 meant that he was raised with the explicit expectation that his ultimate duty would be to conquer France and reclaim his father's contested territorial rights. The primary catalyst of Edward's character was the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War, an inheritance dispute over the French throne between the Plantagenets of England and the Valois of France. From a young age, Edward was immersed in a society mobilized for war. While his father campaigned abroad, the young Edward was often left in England as the nominal keeper of the realm, a ceremonial role that nonetheless exposed him to the bureaucratic and logistical demands of running a state at war. Another profound influence was the foundation of the Order of the Garter in 1348. Following his early military successes, Edward III established this exclusive chivalric order, restricted to the king, the Prince of Wales, and 24 elite knights. This institution bound Edward to a fiercely loyal brotherhood of warriors who valued martial prowess, aggressive pursuit of glory, and strict codes of aristocratic honor. The prince's closest companions, men like John Chandos and James Audley, were drawn from this inner circle. Furthermore, Edward was heavily influenced by the contemporary practice of the chevauchée, a strategy of deliberate scorched earth raiding designed to terrorize the civilian population, destroy the enemy's economic base, and force opposing armies into pitched battles. This combination of high chivalric idealism and brutal total warfare would define Edward's entire worldview. Edward's transition from a royal figurehead to an active military participant began in July 1346, when he accompanied his father on a major invasion of Normandy. Landing at La Hougue with an army of approximately 14,000 men, the 16-year-old prince was formally knighted by his father upon stepping onto French soil. This campaign was designed to be a massive chevauchée, carving a path of destruction toward Paris. Edward's rise to prominence was sudden. Despite his youth, he was given nominal command of the vanguard, the foremost division of the English army. While experienced veterans like the Earl of Warwick and John Chandos were placed beside him to provide tactical guidance, the prince was physically present in the thick of the fighting. His first major test came during the crossing of the River Somme, where the English army, desperately trying to evade a larger French force, had to fight their way across a tidal ford at Blanchetaque. The successful crossing allowed the English to secure a defensive position near the forest of Crécy, setting the stage for the prince's ultimate test. Edward's historical breakthrough occurred on August 26, 1346, at the Battle of Crécy. The English army, numbering roughly 10,000 to 14,000 men, was attacked by a French force estimated at 25,000 to 30,000. Edward commanded the right wing of the vanguard, which bore the brunt of the French heavy cavalry charges. During the most intense phase of the battle, the prince's division was nearly overwhelmed. When panicked messengers rode to King Edward III, who was watching from a windmill, to ask for reinforcements, the king famously refused. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the king declared, "Let the boy win his spurs, for I wish, if God so order it, that the day may be his." Whether this quote is verbatim or a later chivalric dramatization, the sentiment was real. The prince was left to fight his way out. He did so successfully, fighting so fiercely that he reportedly collapsed from exhaustion after the battle. Crécy was a slaughter. The French suffered thousands of casualties, while English losses were in the mere hundreds. Among the dead was the blind King John of Bohemia, who had insisted on being led into the fight. Legend dictates that the young Edward, honoring the fallen king's bravery, adopted his crest of 3 ostrich feathers and his motto, "Ich dien," I serve. While historians debate the exact origin of this adoption, a feathers and motto permanently became the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales. Overnight, the 16-year-old became a recognized military hero across Europe. Following Crécy, Edward's career was defined by a sequence of extraordinary military and political milestones. 1347. He played a crucial role in the successful 11-month siege of Calais, securing a vital port for England that would remain in English hands for over 200 years. 1355. Granted independent command, Edward launched the Grand Chevauchée from Bordeaux. In just 8 weeks, his Anglo-Gascon army marched 300 miles to the Mediterranean and back, destroying over 500 towns and villages, effectively crippling the economy of southern France. September 1356, he achieved his masterpiece at the Battle of Poitiers, capturing King John II of France. The resulting ransom was set at a staggering 3 million gold crowns, effectively bankrupting the French state. 1360. Edward played a key diplomatic role in drafting the Treaty of Brittany, which briefly paused the war, granted England massive territorial concessions in Aquitaine, and recognized Edward III's sovereignty over these lands without feudal obligation to France. October 1361. In a highly controversial move, he married his cousin, Joan of Kent. Because she had been married twice before, one husband was still living, though the marriage was annulled, and they were closely related, the union required a papal dispensation. It was a rare medieval royal marriage based on personal affection rather than diplomatic strategy. 1362. His father created him Prince of Aquitaine, establishing him as the sovereign ruler of a vast territory in southwestern France. Edward established a magnificent, highly cultured, and incredibly expensive court in Bordeaux. April 1367. Edward launched a campaign into Spain to restore the deposed King Pedro of Castile. At the Battle of Nájera, Edward delivered a crushing defeat to a Franco-Castilian army, proving his tactical genius translated beyond French battlefields. Edward's fame rests primarily on his reputation as the ultimate practitioner of 14th century warfare and chivalry. In an era that worshipped martial glory, he was the undefeated commander who repeatedly vanquished larger armies and brought kings back to London in chains. However, his modern reputation is irrevocably tied to his famous nickname, the Black Prince. Strikingly, there is no contemporary evidence that he was called this during his lifetime. The earliest recorded use of the term appears in the writings of the English historian Richard Grafton in 1568, nearly 2 centuries after Edward's death, and was popularized by Tudor historians like John Leyland and later by William Shakespeare. Historians offer 2 main theories for the nickname. The first is that he wore a distinctive suit of black enameled armor, though his extant tomb effigy shows gilded copper. The second, more academic consensus suggests the name was derived from the terror he inflicted upon the French populace through his ruthless campaigns of burning and pillaging. Regardless of its origin, the nickname cemented his mythological status as a dark, indomitable force of war. Behind the armor, Edward was a man of intense contradictions. He was deeply pious, maintaining a lifelong devotion to the Holy Trinity. It was no coincidence that he chose to fight the Battle of Nájera on a Saturday, a day he dedicated to the Virgin Mary. He was also fiercely loyal. Unlike many medieval royal heirs who rebelled against their fathers, a common occurrence in the Plantagenet dynasty, Edward remained steadfastly devoted to Edward III, acting as his ultimate enforcer. His working style was marked by bold, high-risk aggression on the battlefield, balanced by a highly disciplined defensive tactical approach once combat commenced. However, in times of peace, his primary weakness was a lack of political subtlety and an addiction to extravagance. His court in Bordeaux was famously lavish. He spent exorbitant sums on jewels, tapestries, and extravagant tournaments to project power, continually plunging himself into debt. This financial indiscipline required him to constantly raise taxes, a habit that proved disastrous for his political administration in Aquitaine. Edward's glittering career unraveled in his final years due to political mismanagement, failing health, and controversy. The Spanish campaign of 1367, while a military success, was a political disaster. King Pedro refused to pay the promised campaign expenses, leaving Edward crippled by debt. Worse, while in Spain, Edward contracted a debilitating illness, likely amoebic dysentery or a form of dropsy, that plagued him for the rest of his life, rendering him frequently bedridden. To pay his debts, in 1368, Edward levied a deeply unpopular hearth tax, fouage, across Aquitaine. The local Gascon lords, accustomed to high degrees of autonomy, rebelled and appealed to the French King Charles V, reigniting the 100 Years' War. Edward's most controversial moment occurred during this renewed conflict, the sack of Limoges in September 1370. When the city of Limoges dissected to the French, an enraged, litter-bound Edward besieged and retook it. The chronicler Froissart claimed that Edward ordered a merciless massacre, writing that upwards of 3,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets. For centuries, this account stained Edward's legacy as a bloodthirsty tyrant. However,
Modern historians, utilizing local archives, have heavily debated this claim.
Scholars such as Richard Barber and Juliet Barker note that contemporary records suggest a death toll closer to 300, mostly consisting of the garrison soldiers, and point out that under the laws of medieval siege warfare, a city that refused to surrender was legally subjected to the sword. Even so, the brutal optics of Limoges marked a dark end to his military career. Too ill to command, Edward surrendered his principality in 1372 and returned to England to die. Edward the Black Prince's influence was profoundly felt in the realms of military tactics and geopolitics. Directing the English armies, he perfected the combined arms tactics of dismounted heavy infantry and massed longbowmen, a system that fundamentally broke the dominance of the heavily armored aristocratic cavalry that had ruled European battlefields for centuries. His use of the chevauchée demonstrated that psychological and economic warfare could be just as effective as territorial conquest, a brutal strategic philosophy that influenced European conflicts long after his death. Politically, his impact was a double-edged sword. In the short term, he brought unprecedented wealth, glory, and captive kings to England, securing a dominant bargaining position for his father. In the long term, his aggressive taxation alienated his French subjects, leading to the rapid loss of the very territories he had fought to secure. Furthermore, his untimely death at age 45 created a catastrophic succession crisis. By dying before his father, the throne eventually passed to his 10-year-old son, Richard II. The minority rule and subsequent tyranny of Richard II directly seeded the dynastic instability that would erupt into the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century.
Edward the Black Prince died on June 8, 1376, exactly 1 year before his father. He was buried at Canterbury Cathedral, a location he personally chose due to his deep religious devotion. His magnificent bronze effigy still lies there, suspended above which are replicas of his actual battle achievements, his jupon, surcoat, helm, shield, and gauntlets.
For centuries, his image fluctuated. During the Tudor and Victorian eras, he was heavily romanticized as the paragon of English virtue and chivalry, immortalized in statues, like the equestrian monument at City Square in Leeds, and patriotic literature. Today, modern historians view him through a more nuanced, objective lens. He is recognized not as a flawless Arthurian hero, but as a product of his violent age, a supremely gifted tactician and a loyal son, but also a ruthless warlord whose campaigns brought devastation to hundreds of thousands of French civilians. The myth of the Black Prince remains a staple of medieval history, embedded in the very identity of the English martial tradition.
The life of Edward the Black Prince reveals the stark duality of the medieval world, where the highest ideals of honor and chivalry walked hand in hand with the absolute devastation of war. He achieved everything expected of a 14th century royal heir. He won glorious victories, captured kings, expanded empires, and remained fiercely loyal to his sovereign. Yet his story is ultimately one of tragedy. His relentless pursuit of martial supremacy ruined his health, while his political and financial missteps undid his life's work before he even reached the grave. Edward remains an enduring historical enigma, a prince who never wore the crown, but whose shadow stretched across Europe long after the last arrows fell at Poitiers.